Chris, what's going on?
Not much, man. Ready for this Sunday pod? Break down some popular contrarian beliefs.
Yeah. No, excited, man. I know we were talking a lot offline about discovery calls. There's a lot of advice out there, some of it good, but I think our overall consensus is that a lot of it is focused maybe on the wrong things like status or truly uncovering the pain. And like, don't get me wrong, those are absolutely necessary for discovery calls. But in my mind, it's like there's so much information about there. And also, if you're a rep that's really working hard and trying really hard, those things you're going to be able to figure out pretty quickly on your own. So I think today's goal is to really discuss the discovery call framework, if you will, and where I think whether you're new, whether you're trying to just refine your skills, we're not going to tell you how to sell your own product. But I think a lot of people miss on having a really well-structured call and don't realize how much that translates really well to a prospect when you are running a call efficiently, you act like you've been there before, you're very confident and have a lot of sound logic as to why either a next step or not taking a next step and waiting, as an example, until they bring a director to the next call could be appropriate. But before we get too deep in the sauce, Chris, any thoughts to set expectations?
No, I think the biggest key, and also just for me to realize throughout my own tech sales journey, is having a framework in place, but a framework that allows you to be dynamic and fluid. And so to your point as well, what we see happening a lot is there's a lot of people out there that make specific scripts of exactly what you should say, how you should say it, when you should say it, what your tone should be like, all these different things. And I think it's more about, I think the way that we want to structure this today is more have a framework that allows you to be fluid, have a structure that you go into every single call with, but that still allows you to sort of like be your own person, have your own frame, tackle things depending on whatever the unique situation is, right? So I think that's the key element of it all. But I guess we've talked about this a lot. How would you structure a discovery call? I actually took this approach from you, and I've actually used it myself, and I thought it was brilliant, to be quite honest, because it allows you to be super flexible. But I'll throw it over to you. How would you break down a discovery call almost minute by minute, or not necessarily minute by minute, but like some sort of framework to break it down?
Well, I think minute by minute is a good analogy that a lot of people don't think of, because when you go into a call and you're thinking, oh, I need to uncover pain, I need to uncover the business value, I need to uncover all of these things, what gets lost when you go too deep down that rabbit hole is you might do that and you're 27 minutes into the call and you haven't shown your product at all, right? And so I will say, in fairness, I won't say their name on the pod, but the framework that I taught you, I learned from someone else. So I find it works really well, and that person, absolute killer, someone I really respect in the industry, still doing really big things. So I think when you're thinking about it at a minute by minute framework, the important thing is to just kind of have like mental blocks. And if you go a minute or two over, that's fine. And we're not going to say every single minute of 30 minutes. But I think the goal here is when you're talking and when you catch yourself thinking, do I have this? Do I have this? You can also shoot your eyes up to the top right of your computer and look at the time and say, okay, I've got about 5 minutes left and I need to get this. And now it just helps you keep things very fluid. The prospect doesn't feel like they're getting like a mechanical, like if you could wave a magic wand and solve anything in your business. Nonetheless, sorry, that was a bit of a segue, but to your original question on more or less a minute by minute framework, and for those that are watching, if you get anything away from this, I would think it's largely this, and what tends to work well is, roughly speaking, we're taking a 30-minute call here, and the prospect for some way, shape, or form has agreed to discuss further. I think 2 minutes early on of a beginning kind of like small talk and agenda setting is ideal. And again, this doesn't take into account, maybe it has to be 4 minutes because you're waiting for one other person to come in from a different meeting. This is the whole point of this kind of loosely defined framework. But 2 minutes of formal intros, maybe some small talk, and setting the agenda. Again, something that could be formal or informal. I'm personally, in a first discovery call, not a huge fan of hitting them with slides. In my mind, it just turns everyone's brains off and they're like, here we go, another sales pitch. So even if it's just at the end of this 2 minutes, you said, hey, it looks like we're all here now. I really appreciate everyone joining. I want to make sure we make the most of this time. What I had in mind for today is really taking the chance to understand where you're at today. You may even throw some context in. Like, I know you emailed us and reached out to us saying that you had this, this, and this. I'd love to learn more about that. And then time permitting, just give you an overview of how we kind of fit into that problem. And if appropriate from there, set next steps and move forward. Anything else, Mr. Prospect or Mrs. Prospect, that I can add before we get started? Like that's a simple way I like to set it off without slides. From there, and I'm not going to break this down in its entirety for the sake of time here, and I'll kick it back to you here shortly, is so you set the agenda. The next, let's call it 18 minutes, and I would say give or take 2 minutes on either side. This is really the meat of the discovery. This is where you're doing almost all of your discovery. We'll break it down further, but now you've used, let's call it 20 minutes of the call. From there, I would say 6 minutes from minute 20 to 26. Ideally, you're showing your platform and product, and actually, again, we're assuming if you're watching this, you're a capable rep, and we're not going to tell you anything you don't know when it comes to tying your solution to the actual pain of the prospect. But then the remaining 4 minutes are what I like to do in terms of high level confirming the purchasing process. If the deal is real and you're trying to further qualify it, I think you can probe into the buying process. We'll get into that. And then also obviously set up the appropriate next steps. So that, just restating, because I know that was a ton, 2 minutes intro and agenda, 18 minutes of discovery, 6-ish minutes of showing your product, and 4 minutes confirming the buying process and setting next steps. I'll pause there. That was a ton, but
no, I think that's solid. I think that framework has helped me a lot too, of just like not necessarily feeling like I have to ask 15 questions inside of my Google Doc, but rather it's like, all right, we're at 2:15 p.m. I have a couple more minutes to do some discovery. Let's see how much more I can uncover about their current situation, their desired situation. And then once I get to that 10-minute mark, I can start tying it back into like, all right, you told me this XYZ. This is how exactly we can help you with that. This is where we tie in. This is specifically why we differentiate from other products as well out there. Something along those lines, right? So I think just having that framework allows you to be fluid, allows you to just go into a conversation, not like sounding like a robot, right? Because I think that's what happens a lot is people go out there, they download the 11 best discovery questions that will change your life and turn you into a top performer at a sales tool company or whatever else, right? It's like that sounds great on paper. And
Chris, if there's one thing this year that would totally change your business, what would that be? Yeah.
Or even like, I don't want to get into this because we do these all the time and we think they're so funny. And I think it just comes down to like, I think what those do is the opposite of what you're trying to accomplish. You don't want to sound like a sales rep. You're actually trying to do everything in your power to not sound like a sales rep, right? That is how you win. You don't win by asking, hey, if you could wave a magic wand, this is like, what would your life look like? Or if you could stack rank these, depending on XYZ, what would it look like? It's like when you say those things, immediately in their mind, like what do they associate a salesperson with? They associate a salesperson with like a car salesman, like somebody who's slimy, right? So the moment that you start going down that path of asking those types of questions, even a single question can throw off a prospect, right? We always talk about being consultative and like actually challenging our prospects, but you're not doing those different things, right? You're just being, excuse me, but like you're being super cringy and it's super uncomfortable for the prospect. Instead, I would almost try to flip the script as like, how would you react to that? Yeah. Right? Like let's say that you were looking at software, and sometimes that's hard for people to do because they've never been on the other side of it, but how would you react to those questions, right? Yeah. I mean, a simple exercise would literally just be like, if you were asking those types of questions today, like maybe go through like a gong call and review, maybe you did go online, you found the 10 best discovery questions, you went through, your neighborhood influencers, discovery course or whatever else, and you're asking these questions in your gong call. Maybe just ask somebody who isn't in sales, like write down the questions that you're asking, ask those questions to somebody who isn't in sales and see what their reaction is. Yeah. And maybe try to make it somebody who isn't like your mom or your dad or something who's always going to be like, yeah, that's great, I love it, Yeah. But I think that puts it into perspective, and not to get too sidetracked here, but I think that's the biggest mistake I see with discovery as well is, one, not having that framework, but two, trying to fit in like a million different questions and make it too rigid, make it too like structured or whatever else. Yeah. But maybe just to get back on track a little bit, maybe we can go a little bit deeper into those specific topics. So I know the first two, we're talking about small talk, we're talking about agenda. How would you do that the right way? I have some input on this too, but maybe we break it down sectionally so people have an idea of like, how do you actually approach this? How do you approach discovery? How do you approach next steps? How do you do it like the right way, or at least an example of it? Yeah. Right?
Yeah, I think for me, I'll be honest, sometimes I'll do some research on prospects for like huge calls. But, kind of standard small talk for me in terms of like where you calling in from with remote work as an example. And to be honest, like my general preference is to kind of get right into it. Especially, again, I think this does also relate more to the types of personas I sell to, which are generally highly, highly technical DevOps types of personas and engineers and whatnot. So they don't really appreciate all the small talk as much. I know in your situation, you're kind of talking to a lot of founders and whatnot. So we can get into that dynamic. But I will say sometimes if someone's in a good mood or whatever it might be, there are some lines I'll throw out and just be like, it's already Wednesday. Like, how's the week going? Where are you calling in from? Or, just make a comment. Like at my company currently, we had Friday off this past week for what they call Dutonian days. And so I may make a comment. I'll be like, hey, it's Wednesday, but we actually have Friday off as a company. So feeling pretty good. How about yourself? And see if they take that and they're like, oh, that's cool. And like kind of have a more eccentric response to that, then I might small talk a little bit more, as opposed to if I do that and they're like, oh, that's nice. I'm like, cool. Well, let's go ahead and dive right in.
Yeah.
And, that's kind of my thought. Anything from your side?
Yeah, I agree. I think you just got to read the room, right? Yeah. It's like, and that's the problem. If you go into every single conversation and you give the same spiel about like, hey, what's the weather like? And like, that's cool. You can ask that, I think, to gauge. But if you start talking about, oh my God, it's been 85 degrees and I'm so excited to go out like with my sisters this weekend. Like, it's like they don't care unless they've already like talked about that, or if they start talking about it. I'll usually have the same structure, and I don't want to stay on this for too long because it's not necessarily the most important part about what we're trying to get across, but yeah. I'll usually just like ask like, hey, where are you calling in from? Or I'll do some research ahead of time and I'll say like, hey, I saw you. For a lot of the people that I talk to, it's folks that maybe went from a FAANG company, started their own company. So sometimes I'll ask like, hey, like that's super cool. I saw you were at Microsoft for like 11 years. What's the transition been like? Like, what does that look like? Ask something that's a little bit more personable. Again, like try to distance yourself from the average sales rep that comes on the call and it's just like talking about the weather for 4 minutes. Like, I think it's cool to reference that, but if you stay on that topic throughout the entire thing, it's just like, all right, already now they're associating you with the typical sales rep, right? Yeah. But if you ask something a little bit different, already there you're like kicking it off. They're like, oh, this is different. This could be something, unique or fresh or whatever else. So that's how I like to go about it. But again, read the room is the most important element in that specific part of the discovery call per se. Yeah.
What I would say, like one note, and we can move to the next section, is like, it's funny because sometimes I think when I'm selling to large enterprises, like it is cool, obviously, that you're talking to founders and those are questions that they really like. Yeah. An interesting caveat is, like, there's been times where I talked to a senior software engineer and their last job was Netflix. I'm like, oh, I saw you came over from Netflix, and they actually hate the fact that I researched them on LinkedIn. So I won't.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just how it depends, right? It's like you gotta figure out how your prospects react to that, or like what they like to. Again, like it's so situational, right? But you got to figure out. You got to read the room. So like that works for me, and whatever works for you because of the person that you're selling to. And this exactly back to her point is you can read the stuff in a guide. Yeah, right? Yeah. But if you go and you apply it and your prospect is just like, dude, why did you do that? Like, that's such a waste of your time. Like, again, 100%. Yeah. But maybe getting into the next section. Maybe getting into the more important stuff. I think again, like just read the room, have a process, but be fluid. Like, just be a normal human being, I think is the name of the game for the intro and small talk. But the more important stuff, obviously getting into the meat of the call, like uncovering, hey, like, where are you guys currently at? Why the heck are we even talking today? What even prompted you to reach out? Those specific things, like uncovering things about their current situation, desired situation. Mm-hmm. How would you go about that? You are a lot more, I will say this up front, you are a lot more experienced of a seller than I am. You sold across a lot more segments. So I want to get your thoughts on it. I will give my input afterward. But curious. Yeah. Maybe
I'll kind of take the middle of the line approach, and then we can add some nuance for SMB or enterprise or all of these different things. Again, so we've gotten the 2-minute intro agenda. Now we've got about 18 minutes to play with of how do we uncover things, right? And a common kind of quadrant, if you will, of things to uncover that I have been trained that my company does currently is throughout discovery, you want to uncover the current state. How are they doing what they do today? Any like negative consequences or pains or problems associated with that. The future state, or like what do they think would be an ideal solution? And then the business outcomes of that. So if they had that solution in place, what would that mean? And again, it doesn't even necessarily mean it's specifically your tool. These are kind of like meta abstract things. Mm-hmm. where I think this kind of overall blanket in your mind of 18 minutes is very beneficial is because I see a few different things happen. Sometimes you may have a prospect that has a lot of pain and they have no idea what they want. And so during this 18 minutes, they're not even really going to be able to tell you what they want in a future state or tie it to business outcomes because everything's just such a mess.
Yeah.
Like, and I'm actually working on a deal like that currently where, credit to the company, I mean, it's a very, very prominent company, but some of their systems are so legacy and ancient. It's almost like, hey, we're pretty much going to blow this up and start from scratch. So we're going to tell you all about our problems. We don't even know what the perfect solution looks like, which is why we need your guidance and your solution potentially. And then we can kind of, but all I'm saying is like in those situations, if you really understand the current state and pain associated with that, I would spend the majority of that 18 minutes there, because even if you told them what the future looks like, even if you talk about a business outcome or we can increase your revenue or increase operating efficiency, that's such a distant future, it really doesn't hit home.
Yeah.
So again, going back to it, for these 18 minutes, I think more than half, call it roughly 60% ideally, is talking about what they're doing today and all of the pains associated with that. And to be honest, if you don't even get necessarily to the future state and the business outcomes across that time, that may be okay. Like it may be okay, because if, like, the flip side of the analogy I just gave is there are, especially with engineers and technologists, there's a lot of people that maybe they came from another company and they used your tool at that past company and they want to use it here, but they're 6 months into the job. Sure, maybe they were brought in to lead this change, but there's so much internal complexity that they don't even know yet. They don't even fully understand that, even though you know what the future state is, and the prospect is saying, hey, my director, I want to bring in this tool because it allowed us to automate all of these different things at my last job. When you really get deep into it, if they don't understand the full depth of the problem they're trying to solve, I've seen a lot of those deals where we invest a ton of time and it falls apart at late stages. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I don't know if I'm getting too hypothetical, but just like restating, I would say 60 to 70% of this should be, what are you doing today? When we're thinking about, let's maybe take each of these buckets in like their place. So current state and like pain or negative consequences. For the current state, it's like, what are you doing today? Who is impacted by that? How many of your team members use this, right? And it's not saying like, oh, is that a problem? It's literally just defining, like, what do you do today? Who's impacted? What is the impact to your customer? Has there ever been, this type of situation with it? And then when you really get into the pains, it's like, hey, you obviously reached out to us because things aren't perfect today. Tell me about some of the limitations of everything you just described to me. And obviously that's like a high level question. I'm not saying that's like the silver bullet.
Yeah.
But then I just want to make that distinction to people. It's really easy to hear something and say, oh, that sounds like a problem, when actually you should really understand the breadth of what they're doing today and who that truly impacts before you can have a more complete understanding of the pains associated with that.
Yep.
So I'll pause there. Obviously, we have the future state and the business outcomes, but I've been talking a bunch. I'll pause. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's good. I take a much more laxed approach to it, but I agree. Like, I think that is essentially what you're uncovering. A lot of the times, too, is like during discovery, you're also, like, people come to you and they think they have an understanding of what they need. Mm-hmm. Right? But in reality, it's like something completely different.
Yep.
So even for me, like during discovery, I'm trying to just like figure out. So what I sell is like security and compliance, right? So a lot of the times, like for the people that I sell to, they come in and they're like, hey, we just had an enterprise request this type of compliance or this level of compliance, this framework, this attestation. They don't know much more about it. So I'm like, okay, like, why do you think that you need this specifically, right? Like, okay, you have one person. How many people have you had in the past? And maybe in the past, they're requesting more international standards, right? So it's like, is it really worth it to do this versus doing that? Do you know the differences and nuances of this, and that? And so I think like throughout discovery, you kind of learn, you uncover like, what are you really looking for? What do you actually need? Because they come in, they think, I need this. And during your discovery, you can and this is how you're consultative, really. Yeah. Right? It's not necessarily like asking a million questions and bringing all the value back to you as a seller, because if they leave that call not feeling like they've got anything out of it, you might walk away from that as a seller and you think, oh my God, I killed that. I crushed it. I got so much information out of that, right? But they're like, I didn't, like, that was a waste of our time. I didn't learn anything, Yeah. So I think that's the challenge. And I think in more of like a rigid sales structure, that is more implied because, I mean, big tools, like well-positioned tools, like they probably already know what the tools do like to a 90% certainty or to a 90% degree.
Yeah.
But with smaller tools, when you're like breaking into the market and those different things, I think there needs to be more of like an emphasis on like, oh, okay, so like you think you need this. In reality, like based on who you're selling to, based on like the fact that you're going up market, this might be a good option as well. And sometimes they walk away from that call feeling like, holy shit, like they actually understand, what I'm going through right now.
Yep.
And so I think that's how I try to run them. But I agree, you can't really get to that conclusion unless you really get the context around like what are they doing, how are they doing it? Because you can ask them, like, and this is why I hate this question is like, hey, if you could wave a magic wand, right? Or if you could stack rank your top priorities or whatever else, these people that I sell to, they don't freaking know. Like they don't know what they're going to do even like 2 years from now, right? They don't even know if they're going to be in business 3 to 5 years from now. So I can ask to stack rank all that, I want. And they won't be able to give me a good answer about that. So you have to go deeper, right? You have to understand, why are you looking for this? Okay, is this really what we need right now? Because we can also help you in XYZ ways. Yeah. And that's when they have those aha moments, right? Anyway, I'm getting super deep as well.
No, sorry to cut you off because you bring up a really great example too that I want to highlight more on, kind of that enterprise side as well. Mm-hmm. There's a conversation I've shown you, and I won't get too specific here on the pod, but I think the other side of this too is, to your point, you have founders who have all the ability to buy in the world. They think they know what they want, and you consult them and you build a lot of rapport that way. I think when you sell to bigger organizations, oftentimes for I would say first discovery calls, there's obviously exceptions. We're not going to talk about how to network into leadership and those types of things. That's outside this scope. Mm-hmm. But let's say, I don't know, Verizon, senior engineer at Verizon fills out a demo request. You're going to take that call, right? Yeah. But what I've seen on the flip side of this is they kind of think they know what they want, but they're so disconnected from the buying process. You have to know that this is going to be a waste of time. And a very, I think, great example that complements the ones that you brought up is I spoke to an engineer in the past. This was earlier on, and we were looking at some different software that would automate different processes. And we sat there and we talked kind of about the current state, their current situation, how they did things, and it hit a lot of the value propositions of what we could potentially do. Then when we got more into the actual pain and really dove into it, we were sitting there with, I think it was a senior engineer, some mid-level title, and they're talking about, well, hey, I really just want to test this software because it's going to replace 3 headcount on this team. And we're like, oh, interesting, okay, that sounds great. That sounds great. And to the average rep, I'm sure they had gotten trials activated because of that. But we really dove deep. It's like, okay, interesting. So those 3 individuals, tell me more about it. To make a super long story short, I'm leaving out a ton of details. Those 3 engineering team members were based overseas. Mm-hmm. So they had a very, very low salary. And when he put a ballpark figure on it, it was going to be like $30,000 to $40,000 of savings for a tool that was going to cost minimum $40,000 to $50,000, and at scale, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yeah. So it's like, what are we, and I think a lot of people will hear these high level value props and they'll think, oh, great, they're doing this, which is exactly like this customer. And oh, they want to replace 3 people. That's great. But again, going back to a point we made earlier, which is of the 18 minutes of true discovery, if you will, I would rather you spend more time on the current state and pain than worrying and trying to paint some vision of what the future could be. Because I could have been like, exactly, we're going to replace those 3 people. We're going to automate all of these systems. And then when he went to go get a signature and they're like, so let me get this straight. We're going to save $40,000 and spend $40,000. And our team has to learn a completely new tool. And I haven't even seen this completely work in our environment, right? So just shedding light onto another flavor of your example there, where you may talk to someone with authority and you can consult them. And the case where you're working into a bigger account where they don't have authority, you have to really understand if there's true pain at multiple levels before you can even worry about saying, yeah, we'll solve that, because you can solve it, but it may not matter at all. And I've seen that time and time again. So yeah.
No, I agree. And I mean, I think you also can't really pitch your product without properly understanding. Yeah. Again, this is where they come in and they will tell you, this is what I want. But then your pitch, your generic pitch of your product doesn't hit that at all. But then during discovery, you'll realize, and you'll make them realize as well, as holy shit, I actually need this instead. Yeah. And then you tie it back in during that pitch. So I guess maybe let's stay on the discovery part a little bit longer. What do you think are the most important things to uncover to kind of give yourself enough ammunition to, one, create a really strong, compelling pitch, move it forward in the rest of the deal cycle, get the right people involved, and all those different things. Or not necessarily get the right people involved, but to be prepared for whenever those people do get involved. Like, what are you trying to get out of discovery from your side, from the seller's perspective?
Yeah. I mean, to oversimplify, and again, for everyone watching, it's like I sell to highly technical personas. So, you fill in the gaps specific to your situation. But I think one of the things I often overlook, especially having been an engineer prior to being in sales, is earlier on in my career, I would get really focused about the how of how the technology fixed it and not just the total scope of who it truly impacted. So like I have another example that comes to mind where I had a really great discovery call, and it was like literally if we put that recording on YouTube, people would think, wow, Eric's the greatest salesperson ever. He uncovered so many different things. But to answer your question like directly, it's truly like how painful the problem is. And is that compelling enough to do something about it in the next 6 to 12 months? Yeah. And that's like a simplified in layman's terms how to do that. But I think, I was far along enough in my career to understand that when I had this person's pain and problem and all of these different things discovered, it was great. And like we definitely added value. But when I asked him like, hey, so when this goes down, does that impact your customers? He's like, no. I was like, oh, okay. So it sounds to me more like this is like internal efficiency. Like, are you blocked internally of doing things when things go down? And they're like, yeah, but at the end of the day, if it goes down for like a day or something, it's not a huge deal.
Yeah.
And it's like with two questions, the prior 30 minutes of my call just didn't matter, and these are kind of point examples but I really just, I can't stress enough how important it is to understand the scope. And I think that's where a lot of people get pigeonholed early on in their careers. They're like, I'm talking to a senior person, they matter. And they're like, how does this impact you? What does this mean for you? And they're not even asking simple questions like, okay, so who all is impacted by this problem, right? What does this mean for your customers that are on your website? Yeah. What does this mean for your internal developer team? And if there's really not a lot of meat on the bone beyond that individual person, unless it's like C-suite, it's really, really tough for that to hold weight against the 40 priorities they have as a company this year when it comes time to signing a check for hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that's, I don't know, maybe that was a short and long answer, but yeah.
I think this is very interesting because I can tell that the way that you think about this is very much so tailored to more mature organizations. So like for you, for instance, you are giving yourself the ammunition to build a really strong, compelling business case.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, and this is probably a pretty good distinction to make as well, is like you are in a much more strategic sale, right? You are much more upmarket in that sense. For me, I have access to power almost immediately. Yep. And so I need to actually figure out on that very first call, like, hey, what's the timeline? Budget wise, like, I mean, we even talk price, which is pretty crazy on the first call because I need to be able to qualify, disqualify, like, hey, I don't want to get to the third or fourth call, go through a demo, a POC, a trial, all these different things, and then that be a waste of time because of the velocity of the deals that I have ongoing. So it's so situational, right? Another really important thing for me to figure out is like, is the deal competitive, right? Like, do I need to tie this back in specifically to our differentiators versus the rest of the product, or is that added noise and actually pushing them over to competitors? So like, these are the little things where this is what completely changes how you tackle discovery across every single stage, because you wouldn't necessarily be doing that in your first discovery call. But for me, if I don't do that, the deal is lost because they're making a decision within 7 to 10 days.
It's a great call.
Right? So it's just very interesting in that sense. And this is the problem, again, going back to is like you can download all your PDFs. You can download all these different things from your LinkedIn influencers and different things like that. I always say this. I mean, I'm probably like, I sound like a broken record at this point, but there's no better proxy for success than going internally to see like, how are these being ran? Yeah. Right. And we can talk about, we can give general advice and we have really, really good advice, I personally believe. But it's up to you out there as the individual to take this and then mold it into like your specific situation, to put it into like your normal sales cycle. Because if you sell sales tools to salespeople and you try to do our approach, they're like, hey, why didn't he spend a couple more minutes on talking about the weather? Like, what the hell? It's like stuff like that, Yeah. So anyway, I think this is really interesting to me as well, because when I pick your brain, for instance, on certain elements of discovery, I can really come across as like an expert. But I think if I take too much of that, and vice versa, if you took what I did in your specific shoes, they would be like, what the fuck is going on? It's like, what is this guy doing? So just very interesting in that sense of, you got to look at like one, where your company is actually positioned in the market, right? If it's a really competitive field, I mean, that's one of the biggest things for what I sell. Like Vanta, we are market leaders. However, there's so many other players in the field to where like I need to identify how competitive is this? How, like, which specific differentiators do I need to target depending on whatever competitors they're looking at? Stuff like that.
Yep.
Right. Anyway, that's
that's a great call out. And yeah, really emphasizing too. It's like oftentimes you bring up a great point, because early on in my career, one of my biggest wins at the SMB segment, we had an urgent request from a CTO, and exactly that. We were head to head against Amazon.
Yeah.
And like I went real hard outside the scope of today's video of like differentiating ourselves right away. But yeah, when you're dealing with a 12-month cycle, who cares if you're competing with 3 different vendors? Like there's a time and a place to bring that up. But yeah, it's interesting to see, like, looking in your situation, how much that has changed, I guess. So I think maybe that's a good transition into, we've kind of talked about discovery, and again, the future state and the business outcomes, like pending the market segment, that's also going to just vary so much. But I think I'm honestly going to make the assumption that if you've made it this far in the episode, like you're an intelligent rep and you're striving really hard, based on your product and the average prospect that you speak with, how to ask them about, okay, what does a perfect solution look like? And again, that's agnostic from your product. Like, it's not like, what would it look like if you had my product? It's like, okay, I understand the pain a lot. It sounds like you've put a lot of thought into this. From your perspective, outside looking in, if you're making a drastic move, what is a year from now? What does a success look like a year from now?
Yeah.
Forget the tool for a second. They'll talk about that. And then, if you have a really serious problem, ideally you can bring that to business outcomes. And a lot of times there, and if we want to double tap into this, we can. I'm just kind of breezing through it because again, it is very important, but it doesn't matter if you don't have a true pain that's really, really meaningful. If we're talking about business outcomes, I oftentimes just reiterate that pain and then bring it back to, so like, okay, so you'd have this in place. And if I'm understanding right, when you have downtime for 2 minutes, your customers are at risk of losing $500,000 of purchases because you're supporting their e-commerce stores. Do I have that right? So obviously, like, is it fair? Is that the biggest driver? What else am I missing here? What other benefit do we have from, having the site on 24/7? Very generic example, but those are ways, again, you can kind of probe into that. If there's anything there, cut me off, but I figure could be a good segue to the final 10 minutes of the call from here if you want. So
yeah. No, I agree. And again, I think this is a very interesting discussion because it's so different. So even out there as a viewer, I would actually think this is a very interesting combo because you can kind of get both sides of it.
Yeah.
Right. For instance, like I can't tie that much value back into my pitch because they don't even know what they're looking for.
Yeah.
Like a CEO or a co-founder, they don't want to go through compliance, for instance, right?
Yeah.
They actually dread it.
Yeah.
And so for me, the art for me is actually more about asking these salesy questions to give myself the ammunition to give a good pitch in ways that aren't salesy. For instance, like, how do I uncover that the deal is competitive, right? Like, for instance, I'll always ask this, and again, I don't want to stay on this for too long, but I think this is actually very, very valuable because you can be much more direct. And I think that is your selling style as well. So like, you own that, right? Like, you just crush that. For me, I'm almost trying not to sound like a salesperson because they're talking to so many different vendors, and the sales people are typically very inexperienced, and so they have a really, really bad taste in their mouths, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to ask these questions to give myself the information in ways that don't sound salesy. For instance, instead of asking them like, hey, what other vendors are you talking to? Which of our competitors are you talking to? If I ask that question, they're not talking to any other competitors, they're going to think I should be talking to competitors.
Yeah.
So instead I'll ask something along the lines of like, hey, how much research have you done? Like, before I get into the spiel about Vanta, before I get into the pitch, like, how much research have you done on us? How'd you find us? If they tell me, hey, just a Google search, I know exactly what comes up in a Google search if they search for compliance automation. So I can already imply in my mind that this deal is competitive. So now in my pitch, I need to actually at a high level tie this into, for the specific ICP that I'm talking to, whether I'm talking to a CTO or CEO, I need to tie that back into like what is important for them. All right, as a CEO, as a co-founder, what's important to you, or most of the time, and based on like what we talked about today, you want to get this done ASAP. You don't want to spend time inside the platform. You just want to get this shit done, and you want to be able to like show this outwardly facing so that you can speed up the sales cycle. Yep. But for a CTO, it's more like, hey, how much time is this going to take? How do we differentiate on a product specific level, like from an automation standpoint, right? So it's like, that's what I'm trying to do in my stuff. And that's because I have access to power so early on.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's staying on that for a little while because I think it's just so, interesting, and this actually paints the picture of the entire episode, is like you can't use a one size fits all solution.
Yeah.
Like you've got to be fluid, you've got to be dynamic. But I think the general framework for how we're doing things in SMB, velocity, mid-market for me versus like how you're doing things in enterprise strategic holds pretty true. I mean, I think if you take what we're each doing and you apply it to those segments, I would say to a pretty high certainty that like you will be successful.
Yeah.
So
100%. And I think looking, kind of going back to the last 10 minutes of the call, where I think you set a great kind of foundation there for, call it the 6 minutes from minute 20 to 26. Again, a loose framework here. No worries if it's 21 and you got to take it a little bit long.
you're screwed.
Yeah. But it's like, to your point, it's like maybe you find that the timeline for this deal is 2 months and it's competitive.
Yeah.
I'm still going to show them my product and I'm not going to shit on my competitors, but I'm going to show products or features in particular, or talk about things that we uniquely do well and encourage them to look at competitors.
Yeah.
And again, outside the scope of this video, but that deal I mentioned earlier with the e-commerce company, that's exactly what I did when I was head to head against AWS, is like, hey, one of the things that is unique about our platform and people in your situation come to us for, and I wasn't even saying like us versus AWS, I'm just saying one of the things you're going to benefit most from right now, I know we've only got a few minutes and we can definitely go deeper on our next call, already subconsciously planting the seed for the next call, is like this feature. And I, walked it out, and I would just say like, hey, all of the people you mentioned here and the different vendors that you're looking at, they take a different approach. I encourage you to ask about it. But as an example, this company was actually using AWS before and still moved to the company I was at the time because of X, Y, and Z. But that being said, I want to talk on 1 and 2 other points that you mentioned, and like at most within these 6 minutes. And again, I might even just be talking. I may show one slide. There's rare cases where if I think it's going to be really powerful, I may log into the platform and screen share and show like one job that could illustrate everything way better than a slide. But oftentimes I may just show the simple architecture, or I may just show 1 or 2 different slides illustrating, I would say at most 3 of the biggest things they illustrated to me to really create interest for that follow-up call. But I think to your earlier point that you made, and I'll hand it back to you, is like maybe, again, if that timeline is more urgent, or if they come in hot and heavy talking about competitors, you're not going to shit on your competitors, but you're going to present those features in a way that make them immediately go back to that competitor and say, how do you guys do this?
Yeah.
How do you do this? And you've already stacked the deck in your favor to be an advantage.
Yeah.
And then the flip side, and the last thing I'd say is, to your point on the enterprise strategic side, it's like if you're coming in day one hot and heavy and you're like, well, we do this better than this person, then they're like, yo, I wasn't even asking. This was borderline just like an informative session. We already spend $5 million a year with you, and we just wanted to talk to a specialist on your team to better understand the capabilities. So it's like, you'll get there. Don't get me wrong. But your features are going to be more about making this enormous problem for them like actually seem like they could solve it in a decent time, as opposed to like trying to plant seeds against competitors and all that. But any other thoughts there?
No. And I think, again, this just changes depending on, we are very fortunate that we work at market leading companies. But for instance, if we didn't work at market leading companies, it changes the game again. We have the luxury of leaning on our product, right? We can say like, hey, make sure that you ask them about this. Make sure that you ask them about that. Have you seen, like, even when you get into the demo, for instance, I know we're getting a little bit outside like the initial first discovery call, but let's say you get into the demo and you know that like this specific feature is very important to them as a persona because of XYZ. You can say, have you seen this in their platforms like throughout the other demos? Or like, make sure that you ask about this, right? Because they're going to go into that call and they're going to ask them about it and they're going to be like, oh yeah, we don't have that. And they know that they're screwed, right?
Yeah.
But if you weren't selling, or if we weren't selling for a market leader, all of a sudden the game changes. You actually want to almost like avoid a trial, because if you get into a trial with a market leader and you know that they have no issues with budget, you're screwed. So how do you win that deal if you get to that evaluation process, right? Or that stage of the evaluation process. So it just changes so drastically. We're very fortunate that we are selling at market leaders, but I don't think everybody out there is in the same position.
Yeah.
And so again, if you just take what somebody is saying who's selling at a market leader with zero competition and you try to apply it, you're done. Doesn't work.
Yeah.
So this is where like I keep coming back to this, because I think it's such an important thing to just like hammer down, is like, it just depends. It just varies.
Yeah.
Right? like you can approach things the way that we do it, but if your company is not in the exact same circumstances, or if your company isn't, you can't come in and be confident and then be like, yeah, like, I just think you should get into a trial and put the tools head to head. If you say that and your tool is dog shit, well, like, cool, like you just lost the deal, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, I think that's exactly it. I mean, you use the ammunition during the discovery call to actually create a tailored pitch, to actually get them interested enough to move over to that next step, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the time people insinuate that they're going to go through a full sales cycle with you. If you don't do good on that first call, and if you don't create enough interest by either tailoring it, like making the pitch super, super compelling to what they care about, they're not going to want to move over to that next step, right?
Yeah.
And if all of your ammunition comes in during the demo, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's too late, right?
Yeah.
So,
and I think, maybe this is a great segue into the last 4 minutes of the call.
Yeah.
Again, loose framework here, but let's say you've given a quick overview and they're like, oh, that sounds great. And ideally, aside from that, maybe they have a couple follow-up questions. That's when they're really interested,
Yeah.
if they're really diving deep. And then I think this is where often people are so excited to say like, yes, my demo hit home. This is a great discovery. Let's set up next steps and we'll go. And I think there's just a little bit that you miss the opportunity to take advantage of. I am curious again on the perspective here of SMB mid-market versus enterprise strategic, because at this level, oftentimes, going back to that example I mentioned earlier of that developer who was solving a $30,000 problem with a $50,000 tool minimum, like one of the things that I've started to do, even though it's a little uncomfortable, again, assuming the call has gone well, assuming these things are hitting home, is in these last 4 minutes, the first thing I'm going to do is say, hey, it sounds like there's a lot here. I would love to obviously dive deeper into the tech and really make sure we understand your use case in full, and also give you a really detailed tour of the platform. That being said, having done this with other companies, I don't want to waste anyone's time. And the last thing I want is for us to have a follow-up call, start a trial, and spend 2 months doing this when we're not aligned on what our pricing is going to be in the first place and what the buying process looks like. So one thing I do want to make note of before we go, if I can give you an approximate pricing range, and or based on your own experience having brought in other tools before, what are the things that you would need to see, and how does this work internally at your company to make sure that every step we take is a good use of our time? Mm-hmm. And that's a really long-winded way. I don't know that I would ask that long of a question on a call, but it's a really good opportunity I think people miss, especially at those enterprise and strategic levels, because if you get a really shitty answer there from a prospect, they probably never bought software before.
Yeah.
And you need to be very wary of doing next steps unless they're willing to bring their manager or other team members to a call. And again, this is situational. If we're talking about a very strategic customer, one that already spends hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars with you, you may have more tolerance because it's better to get your face out there, get known across the team. But I think in many cases, just re-summarizing here, the first 2 minutes of that remaining 4, it's a really great opportunity if you've led a great call to understand the buying process. And so many people are so excited they had a good discovery call, they don't take that opportunity to heat check it. But I'll pause there. What are your thoughts on that? Is there any strategies or things that you do?
Yeah, so for me, it's like next steps or so. And I think, again, in a more enterprise strategic motion, I think the typical evaluation process is pretty static. Sometimes it differs a little bit, like to a certain magnitude. But for me, it's like when I'm selling to CEOs, founders, CTOs, it's exactly what you just said. It's like, have they even bought software before? Do they even know what they're looking for? A lot of the times they don't know what they're looking for. So if I get them provisioned with a trial, they're just going to be even more confused. They're going to be like, this makes zero sense for us at this time. So it's like, I need to figure out, is it even worthwhile for me to like propose a trial as a next step? Is it even worthwhile for me to propose a demo as a next step? Even like qualifying in, qualifying out. We spoke about this previously too. For me, like I'll typically dictate, I'll say like, hey, typically the next step is XYZ, depending on whatever I think is most appropriate.
Yeah.
And then from there, I'll just like ask them a little, obviously we'll get into pricing as well. So like a lot of the times in the segment that I sell in, it's very, very pricing focused, very, very pricing centric. So I don't want to get into that situation either where I have 3 calls with them. 3 calls is a lot for me, given the volume, the amount of velocity that I have in my specific segment. If I waste 3 calls with somebody, I probably lose out on another deal that I could have spent that time on.
Yeah.
Right. And that's significant for me. And so I need to scope that out. I need to figure out a way of like, hey, are these guys serious? Do they have the funds to actually move forward with this? Do they even know what they're looking for? And if it's just price centric. You honestly sometimes just need to have the balls to be like, hey, you know, if cost is the number one priority, we're probably not a good fit.
Yeah.
And it's funny, we've been talking about this a lot too, is like the more that I do that and the more confident that I am about that, it kind of like the prospects are always kind of like, wait a second, like, you know, what the hell is going on here? Like they don't, you know, because they know, right? It's like, and again, this comes back to like being a market leader. If you are a market leader, you have the luxury to do this kind of stuff, right? But for instance, I know that I can't go back 50% like our competitors. So if it's competitive, that's the number one factor. We are wasting our time.
Yeah.
So again, next steps for me depend on what we've discovered in discovery. Like, what does it look like? What's important to them? Price aside, is there any wiggle room here for like whether they're going to evaluate a premium solution with additional features, or are they just looking for the path to least resistance here and they just want the cheapest?
Yeah.
You know, so that's what it is for me. And of course, also like getting next steps in place is the natural next step. If you don't have next steps in place, especially for SMB and even like mid-market, you're screwed because these people are, you know, I mean, they're busy. So that's the biggest thing. And I mean, even us, like as business owners, we fall trapped to that as well. I mean, a lot of the people that I sell to, some of them even have working jobs. And so they just are naturally busy. If you don't keep them accountable with a time set on the calendar, the deal is 80% lost.
Agreed.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, I think really well said, especially in the SMB and mid-market segment. It's a great heat check of how serious they are.
Yeah.
If they're not even willing to put time on, like date and time and accept your invite, then questionable of the standing of your deal. Definitely changes at the enterprise and strategic, and there's so much nuance there. I don't want to, you know, it's not worth flushing out. I think people are smart enough to understand the game time situation.
Yeah.
If we're talking about a 12-month deal cycle and it said, hey, really appreciate the overview, let's connect back in a month and we can keep the conversation going. There's times where that's genuine when you are, again, working a 12-month cycle and you already have some of your products being sold into that account. But yeah, I think, you know, pretty fundamental basics here at the very end of the call, setting the next steps, asking, again, who else should we have on the call? Ideally, maybe you've identified that in discovery of, again, asking about who's impacted by this. Like one of the things I'll do is like, hey, you know, I know you represent your DevOps team, but you mentioned if this goes down, your SRE team has to drop everything they're doing. Who could we bring in from there to see? Because I think they'd really value from a lot of this conversation we had. And again, if they reject that or they're like, I don't know, that may also be a good sign that they're not a very influential person, or they're too focused on one problem that doesn't actually extrapolate to enterprise business value. So anyway, I know I said go back to the basics and then I dove like deep down the rabbit hole, but again, just pull up your calendar, get your solutions consultant. Hey, Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern looks open for us. Does that work for you and your team? Put it on the calendar, send it while you're on the call. And then, you know, again, probably outside the scope of this video, but something we definitely are looking to instill in students in AE Mastery is the great follow-up email, templatizing that, making it basically autopilot as well. Yeah. But any thoughts on kind of the close of the call?
No, I mean, I think that's pretty solid. And I think it is a great heat check just to make sure, like, because you can have a killer call, right? You can teach them a bunch of different things and you can uncover a ton, but they might realize based on the scope, the price, and everything else that it's just not something that's really relevant for them right now. Yep. And so, yeah, like just the simple ask of like, hey, when should we reconnect on this? When's a good time for us to sit down and show you the platform, show you the tool, go through the bells and the whistles, right? And I think even like, this is funny because people love to say, do as much research as you possibly can, which I think like that is an unrealistic expectation in a real world scenario where it's like, if you have as many calls as I do and you do, we don't have time to sit down and do research on every single call.
Yeah.
And so it's like that's a completely unrealistic aspect. However, if you know, for instance, that like success in a demo is highly tied to having the CTO or the technical persona involved, because if you can show all these features to like a CEO and a founder, right? Like that's cool. They're not going to understand like, okay, because they're not the ones actually doing it, right? They're not the ones actually implementing the initiative. Yep. So you can even come to the table and say like, hey, you know, typically exactly like you said it too, like, you know, most of the time, if we don't have somebody who's technical on that demo call, there's not going to be a lot of value to show. They're not going to understand it. Yeah. So I did some research ahead of time. Would it make sense to include XYZ on the call as well?
Yeah.
It's like just having like, just coming to the table prepared instead of like leaving it all up to them. Just give them a simple way to be like, all right, yeah, let's do it. You know, or just include them in the invite or like already have their email ready to go. Throw them onto the multi-threading, right? Yeah. So again, that's getting outside the scope here, but you make that ask If they say no, or like, let's touch base in 3 weeks from now, that's your heat check.
Yeah.
You know, cool. They're not interested.
Yeah.
You could have you could do everything right. And a lot of times that has nothing to do with like how well you did on that sales call or anything else. In today's day and age, honestly, like when they come to the table and they request a demo from you, they're probably like 75 to 80% of the way toward a buying decision anyway. They've done enough research. They know enough about you. This isn't like going to see like a car like 50 years ago where, you know, you haven't seen anything, you don't know what it does, how it works, all those different things, right? Like they know at a high level what your solution does. They probably just want a pricing, to be 100% honest with you, at least in my segment, right? And so you can crush it, you can kill it. That is your heat check. That is where you know. And you'll still do your due diligence, right? Like you'll put a reminder down, reach out like 3 months from now. But for me, at least, that's when I identify, all right, let me go spend some more time on this other deal over here because these guys are ready to move forward.
Yeah, 100%. No, I think maybe a quick recap, and obviously for everyone watching this far, amazing. If you made it, we appreciate it. And we are on Spotify, by the way. A lot of you requested that, so we do have the link in the description to our Spotify page as well. But just a quick recap from my side. You know, I think, again, when we're looking at a 30-minute discovery, just restating, 2 minutes intro and agenda. I typically like an informal agenda, no slide. I just set the stage of 3 to 5 major things we're going to do on the call. 18 minutes of discovery. I think, again, just when you're, you know, preparing your notes or thinking about the questions, I would say 60 to 70% of that time is going to be current state and pain, negative consequences associated with that. So you create the questions specific to your technology, to your company, to your solution, and the typical pains that you see. Try and guide that prospect into really understanding the full breadth, not just of the technical problem, but how many people, how many customers, how many executives this actually impacts. And then on the backside of that 18-minute discovery block, if you can, talk about, you know, the future state, regardless of the solution, what it would look like. And then ideally, if you have it, you're not always going to the business outcomes. So now we've gone through 20 minutes of the call. The remaining 10, I would say about 6 or so minutes is taking all of that discovery, showing, I would say, 3 maximum major benefits of your platform specific to their problems. And then again, like Chris and I talked about, seeding against competition could be one path, and or just really highlighting how easy it would be with your tool, because a lot of enterprise and strategic accounts I work with are so outdated. They're just not even in touch with how easy things can be with tools that were created 30 years after the stuff that they're using. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, if it's going well, using those last 4 minutes to really check if they can either bring people to the next call, if they want to talk about budget, and you really want to take a moment to just get an understanding of how well they know the buying process before committing to time for that next call. And what that's doing subconsciously is saying, hey, my time is valuable. I don't want to waste my time if this isn't going anywhere. So let's just have that. I just like to rip the Band-Aid. And then, setting, you know, back to very fundamental basics here, sending the calendar invite while you're on the call, establishing next steps, putting time on the calendar, and moving forward from there. Anything else I missed on the recap?
Nope, I think that's solid. And we're going to get a lot deeper with stuff like this. We're actually working on our AE Mastery course right now inside of higher levels. And so if you are either looking to break into tech sales, if you're looking to become a better SDR, a better seller, obviously stay up to date on that, and make sure you subscribe if this was valuable. I think we put in a lot of time on this. We're working on this outside of our day job, so that would mean a lot to us. But no, this was a killer pod. Yeah. So I think that's the closure.
All right. Well, we'll see everybody next time.
All right, guys.